Good afternoon. Happy April. Welcome to the April monthly policy update. We're glad to have you with us. I see people joining now. So we will get started in just a moment. It's a really, really busy time right now. And we're grateful to you for joining us to get the latest about what's happening in Washington, D.C., impacting the charitable sector. So again, hello, welcome to Independent Sector's April monthly policy update. I'm Ben Kershaw. I'm the Director of Government Relations here at IS. I'm joined by Jessica Cameron, our close partner at Washington Council Ernst & Young, also by Heather Mead, our close partner at Washington Council Ernst & Young, and by my colleague at IS, Travis Swanson, my government relations teammate. So you have a host of experts here for you. If this is your first time on an IS webinar, welcome. Independent Sector is a national membership organization made of charities, foundations, corporate giving programs working together to ensure all people living in the United States can thrive. Just some housekeeping notes off the top. This is a webinar, so your lines are muted. We welcome questions through the Q&A function. We'll pause periodically to answer those. You're welcome to drop them in at any point. And we do welcome respectful banter in the chat. Y'all are usually pretty good about that. If you're having technical issues, contact publicpolicy@independentsector.org. And this is generally a membership benefit. If you're not an IS member, you are welcome to stick around for now. And you can contact membership@independentsector.org if you want to become a part of this community. So before we start, I also want to respectfully acknowledge I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C. It is the ancestral home of the Piscataway people who are still in the area, working to reclaim their land and their traditional practice. Also, a lot of the buildings and places we inhabit in Washington, D.C. Were built by enslaved people. So wherever you are joining us from, again, welcome. I hope you're hanging in there. There's a lot going on in the world. And with that, I want to turn to our colleagues at Washington Council to give us a breakdown of some of the Capitol Hill focus updates right now. So Jessica, can you let us know, when we last met as this group, we were wondering whether the House and the Senate would ever get on the same page about their numbers for a budget resolution. Can you give us an update on how that's working out so far?
Yeah, so definitely a few updates to share here. And thanks all for being on the call, on the webcast today. I know there's a lot going on in your sector, so I appreciate you all joining in. So we are currently on a 2-week stretch. This is the second week of a 2-week recess that Congress has for the Easter holiday. And so we anticipate things to get back into action on Monday when they return from the break. But before the recess, there was a lot that went down. And so happy to kind of give you a background on that. So, we have talked about before that Congress is looking at passing a large tax bill through the reconciliation process. All that means is that it allows for a lower vote threshold in the Senate. And in order to do so, there are a few strings attached in order to accomplish reconciliation. Most noticeably, it comes with kind of a 2-step process. One is on getting a budget resolution in place. All that means is that it is something approved by both the House and the Senate that says, here is how much Congress can either spend or save in terms of the spending side of things, as well as here is how much Congress can either increase revenues or decrease revenues by. So kind of sets the overall numbers, if you will, for a substantive package to move forward. The second step is obviously the actual bill, the actual reconciliation bill, which they have yet to go to. So last time we spoke, there was kind of a question in terms of what that overall numbers would look like in a budget resolution. And we kind of got an answer, we kind of didn't right before the break. So for both chambers have passed a budget resolution, but they did so interestingly with kind of different instructions for the House as well as the Senate. That's not typically the way things are done in reconciliation. Typically, you have one set of numbers going forward. So what do those numbers look like? You can argue that the House version of the budget resolution is a bit tighter than the Senate. That kind of makes sense since there are certainly a narrower margin. The House can only lose about 3 votes in order for a budget resolution, as well as a subsequent reconciliation package to move forward. And so it said a few things. It said on the tax side, on the revenue side, Congress can afford to lose about $4.5 trillion to extend the TCJA expiring provisions. It also required a quite high number of savings on the spending side. Most notably for Energy and Commerce, the committee that deals with Medicaid, it said you have to come up with $880 billion in savings. And so the question is, what does that look like and how does that move forward? But certainly, the House instructions pose potentially a lot more challenges than if Congress goes with the Senate instruction. So what do the Senate instructions look like? They are a little more lenient. They allow for kind of a current policy baseline for any TCJA expiring provision. So these are the individual and corporate provisions that have either expired or have already changed over as part of the TCJA if Congress does nothing by the end of this year. It did require some savings, but most noticeably not the trillions of dollars in savings required on the House side. So I think the question is, which one do we go through? I think the way I've been describing it is that Congress is kind of, for lack of a better word, half-assed the group project a little bit. So the step one, they're still going to need to come up with the same number ultimately, so that both the House and the Senate, whatever bill gets put forward, that it's the same bill in both chambers so that it can ultimately be passed and signed by the president. So presumably, I think leadership on both sides knows this for Republicans, since again, this is a Republican-only exercise. And so we expect that leadership will maybe hammer out some of those details when they get back or are currently doing so, but certainly hope to have some type of idea of what that looks like when they get back from break. In terms of what that means for the timeline, we know that both the House and the Senate are working diligently on getting some type of reconciliation package together. What that would look like would include things like the TCJA expiring provisions, new policies put forward by the Trump administration, so things like no tax on tips, as well as where this gets a little heartburn for the charitable sector is potentially on revenue raisers. And so we'll kind of see what that looks like. The expectation, or what leadership has talked about, is having a bill done by Memorial Day or signed on the president's desk by Memorial Day. Now last I checked, we're April 24th. So that gives us Congress a little over a month to put something together. I think a lot of folks in DC expect that we'll see something this year, maybe later in the summer, but certainly that timeline is fairly aggressive, especially since, again, going back to this whole budget resolution debacle, we still don't have kind of an overall number of what that looks like. Finally, let me just touch on a few kind of charitable specific provisions that folks are looking at. I think we can kind of group these into nice things to move forward with and to include in a bill, as well as not so nice things on the revenue raising side. As well as I'll let Heather talk about kind of the spending cuts, which I know are also a big concern for many of you. Certainly on the nice to have things, we've heard of things like extending or including the Charitable Act, something that Senator Langford, as well as a number of other House members have asked about. Certainly, I think the issue there, of course, that would give an above the line deduction for charitable contributions. The issue there really is on the cost, so we'll see if that gets included. And certainly, we're potentially looking at a situation where revenues or budgets are going to be very tight for this package. But that's one item, or much smaller items that independent sector has been talking about, in terms of providing some employer incentives for charities. On the revenue saving side, or on the
The naughty list.
The naughty list, there you go, thank you, Ben. There are a few kind of causes for concern that we're watching very closely. One is certainly, I think, I wouldn't say a foregone conclusion, but very likely, is on the endowment tax side. So this is focused on private colleges and universities at the moment, but we're watching that closely to see if that expands. That could potentially look at increasing the rate or expanding the definition of what colleges and universities potentially are subject to the endowment tax. The other item is on HR 9495 that looks at potentially taking away the tax exempt status of certain tax exempt entities that engage or support certain terrorist groups. We saw that with Chairman Smith and some of his legislation he put out last year in response to some of the anti-Semitism folks saw on college campuses as well as across the US. So that's another thing, as well as any other potential changes in this area or any kind of provisions affecting the charitable sector. So certainly things that we're very closely watching and closely watching kind of what goes forward over the next few weeks. So I will stop talking, but happy to answer any questions, but that's kind of what we expect. Certainly I think May will be a very busy month, whether or not a package gets ultimately wrapped up by the end of that month.
Thank you, Jessica. And so we're happy to, if folks want to talk more about, any of the concerning things that Jessica highlighted or other things on our radar, we will certainly get to that. Before we do that, Heather, Jessica noted that House and Senate Republicans have, not yet agreed on overall numbers, which will make some of the specifics hard to agree to too. Have they figured out all those specifics yet?
No, they have not been. And I think that's one of the things that's important for us to remember as a nonprofit community as we think about what happens next versus where we end up at the end of the day. As Jessica mentioned, they're still trying to figure out exactly how to pay for all of the tax changes that they would like to make. The House, as Jessica mentioned, has its own budget rules, which will require different committees to make certain level of cuts. Some of these are going to raise concerns for different parts of our community. For example, the Education and Workforce Committee is going to be one of the earlier committees to go. We expect them to raise their revenue by making certain educational cuts. After that, we're looking for committees like the Energy and Commerce Committee to move forward. They're responsible for finding about $880 billion in cuts. Originally, they had thought that would all come from making changes to the Medicaid program. They can probably only get to about half of that, but that's still a lot of substantial change to the Medicaid program and to other healthcare programs. Finally, I would flag that there is also $230 billion that is supposed to come from the committee that oversees SNAP, so food assistance programs. All of that won't come from SNAP changes, but some of it could come in proposals that might add work requirements or additional work requirements to SNAP, for example. So all of these things are not public yet. And the members of Congress have not seen them yet. So one of the things that's going to start to happen over the next couple of weeks is that this legislation will be made public. People will have the opportunity to view what's in it. Members of Congress will also be reviewing it along with you, which will allow kind of this opportunity for community conversation before they move forward with the legislation. As Jessica noted, the Senate has a different process and a different timeline. So the things that we see in the Senate may be different from the things that we see in the House before they come to a final agreement on what this package should look like. So there'll be a lot of iterations and changes between here and there as they work to figure out how to pass this reconciliation package.
Thank you, Heather. And so I think you've gotten at this, a little bit. We have a question about areas of overlap between the House and the Senate. You noted that they have their own processes. I guess one version of this question is, are these committees with overlapping jurisdiction? Do you think, are they coordinating behind the scenes as well?
Yeah, they are coordinating behind the scenes, and I think in different places, right? So, for example, on the tax package, I think there's greater coordination and understanding of what the provisions are that are being worked on. When it comes to the specific cuts that are going in, that's a little bit more separate. There's a general understanding, but they're not writing those pieces of legislation together. The House is going to go first. They're going to try to get their greater level of cuts through the House, which is a very difficult process with their request for a higher level of cuts and very narrow margins. The Senate doesn't have that same onus to achieve that same level of cuts, but they're going to try to get to a very similar level with the House. So that will make it easier to pass that final bill. But there will be differences between the two.
Got it. And then Heather, this is another question we're getting in the chat. Can you talk a little bit about how the Trump funding freezes, DOGE, and rescissions play into the budget reconciliation process? Which ones can they count?
Yeah, right. This is a really good question. So there's sort of two answers to this question. The technical answer is 0 of these things will count towards actual cuts unless they go back in and they legislate the changes. They also will not actually get credit for things that have already been done, but they could get credit for extending some of these things that are temporary, for example. So if you want credit, you have to actually legislate it. However, one of the things the House could do, they're not subject to the same strict budgetary rules that the Senate is subject to, which means they could take changes that the administration is making. And while they won't get technical credit from the Congressional Budget Office, they could say, here, we're trying to reach 4 trillion in savings. Look, we've achieved this type of savings through tariffs. We've achieved these types of savings through DOGE. We've achieved these types of savings through cuts to the federal workforce. And so we would like to allocate, these portions of activities to our savings. The last time the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed, they used two kinds of counting mechanisms to figure out how much savings they had achieved. They had one mechanism that looked at the potential economic growth created by the tax cuts. And then they had the more traditional model that CBO uses. So they were able to look at two different ways of measuring the effects of the legislation. We could see them do something similar here if they're unable to come to agreement on all of the other types of programmatic cuts that they're looking to achieve.
It's helpful, thank you. Just because the questioner also noted the Inflation Reduction Act, I would just note that I think it is still our expectation that that's a source. Repealing many of those tax credits is probably a revenue source for tax writers in this bill, is still our sense. Probably an open question as to how much, how many of those get repealed, but
yeah, and honestly, I was just on the Hill right before that. They're still figuring out, to your point, Ben, exactly what levels of cuts they need to achieve on some of those things.
Thank you. So we are I want to turn us to appropriations next. But before we do that, we have a question about an article that was noted some potential troubling changes to the tax bill, specifically around nonprofits. And I'm not 100% certain which article this is. If it's the one that I read, I would flag a couple potential things we're hearing, at least in the ether, if not necessarily on the table, for the tax bill as it relates to the charitable sector, right? So Jessica mentioned potential increases in the university endowment tax rate. We continue to vigilantly monitor any whiff of also increasing endowment taxes on private foundations or other nonprofits. It's not our sense at the moment that that is in proposed legislation. We'll keep at that. Some of the other proposals that have come out of the House Budget Committee, I think have also been were referenced in some articles recently around, essentially carving up portions of the charitable sector, carving out portions of the charitable sector, and whether it's declaring, for example, as the House Budget Committee's options document noted, getting rid of nonprofit hospitals. We would see any proposal to pare back who is and who is not a charity as something we would look at with great concern. We think that they're looking at nonprofit hospitals. It's not our sense that the legislation that gets released in the next few weeks will eliminate nonprofit hospitals, but we know it's an area where the committee's focused, even publicly in hearings and whatnot. We've also heard concern about some think tank reports calling for more taxes on nonprofit activity, treating nonprofits more like businesses. And again, we've read those reports. We've seen media coverage of those reports. Encouragingly, we have not seen legislators talk about applying the corporate income tax rate to all non-donation revenue, as some think tank folks have floated. Those would be really concerning proposals. In 2017, Congress expanded the unrelated business income tax a little bit and rather haphazardly. And one of those provisions was so ill thought and harmful that the charitable sector was able to get it repealed, a year or so later. So we don't think there are major non-controversial revenues to be raised using the unrelated business income tax. So as to whether legislators agree or as to whether they try to do something, really painful for us, we don't know, and we'll remain vigilant. And, we may know more in the next couple of weeks. A lot of general answer to a very specific question. That's the best we got for now. Again, please put further questions in the Q&A box. I do want to touch really quickly on the appropriations process, which has kicked off on the Hill. It feels to me like a little bit less fanfare than in other years, given everything else that's swirling. Jessica or Heather, could you give us a really quick snapshot of where the FY26 appropriations process sits?
That's good. Do you want to do that? Sure. So, sorry, no one's going to start there. Apologies, everyone. Yes, we have kicked off the appropriations process for the year. Most of the offices have completed their request process and are moving forward with accepting, direct requests, even though those sort of the final destination of those requests is still a little bit unclear. The committees are moving forward with their processes as well. All of this, of course, is being kind of overshadowed by the reconciliation process. And we expect that to be the case through the next couple of months. But I didn't know if you had specific places that you wanted to raise for folks.
No, mostly just that, I guess we're hearing, right, most of the request deadlines for subcommittees are mid to late May. And so, right, best guesses we've gotten from Hill offices are that maybe there could be markups in June. But we don't have a whole lot. You wouldn't, I don't think the Appropriations Committee would want to be saying right now that they won't be marking anything up until July. So it seems like June is what we're going to hear.
Yeah, and a number of offices that I've spoken to have already closed their appropriations request process. And so I think it's definitely at the point where it's an office by office request.
Jessica, if you have anything else to add on that, please do. Otherwise, can you give us a little bit more of a sense about the language you noted around, terrorism financing, this bill that was HR 9495, which, independent sector and many, many others spoke out really strongly against last year, and its outlook in the in the reconciliation process, House and Senate.
Sure. And I think the short answer is it depends on who you talk to. I think you'll get a sense of whether or not could be in the bill. The long answer is that, so HR 9495 was definitely a House Ways and Means exercise. Congressman Kustoff very much took the lead on this bill, particularly the aiding and supporting terrorist organizations piece of it. And so when you talk to the office, they're very much optimistic or hopeful that it would be included. And certainly Chairman Smith has been very supportive of the bill last year with kind of a variety of other pieces of legislation that Ways and Means marked up. If you talk to folks on the Senate side, I think they share the sentiments in terms of anti-Semitism, of supporting terrorist groups, right? Certainly have concerns about kind of the reasons for the bill, if you will. But there isn't any Senate companion legislation, and I think there's not as much of an interest in kind of going that route going forward. The last thing I'll note is that, remember for reconciliation, we talked about strings attached in terms of what can and cannot get in a bill. And for 9495, it doesn't have it doesn't score or it doesn't have a significant material score for if it were to be passed. And so one thing for reconciliation is that every provision has to have a budgetary effect, i.e. it's got to raise or lower revenues or raise or lower spending. And that's just not the case, at least how it's constructed at the moment. So something that we're following closely to see if it gets in, but I think there are some stumbling blocks along the way if folks will push for it.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about the tax and reconciliation and budget process and the appropriations process today, and we should. But there are a lot of other issues that are also, urgent and timely for the charitable sector. And Travis has an update on some of those for us today. So Travis.
Thank you, Ben. Am I in now? Great. So I just wanted to, as Ben said, I just wanted to flag a couple of things. First is an important development regarding the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Following an executive order signed last month by the Trump-Vance administration, which we talked about on last month's call, the Department of Education has officially launched the negotiated rulemaking process to consider changes to the PSLF program. As part of that process, the department is holding two public in person at their headquarters here in Washington, D.C. on April 29th, and the second will be held virtually on May 1st. So these are coming up very quickly next week. Both hearings will be held from 9 a.m. to noon Eastern time, and then we'll break for lunch and resume from 1 to 4 p.m. If anybody is interested in providing public comment, you can register to participate in these hearings by emailing. I'm going to drop the email address in the chat once I'm done speaking. And that you do so no later than noon Eastern time on at least one business day before the hearing that you wish to attend. You can also submit written comments via the portal at regulations.gov. This is a really key opportunity to lift up personal experiences with PSLF, as well as how they have benefited your organizations as a recruitment and retention tool. So we're kind of hearing some rumors that there may even be some more potential changes coming to the program via executive order. So really important that we make our voices heard throughout this process to let the administration know how these changes will potentially impact our sector. And I just dropped that email address into the chat. And then next, I just also wanted to take a moment to highlight a recent report that underscores just how much value volunteers are bringing to our communities. The 2025 Value of Volunteer Time Report, released just this week, shows that the estimated worth of volunteer hours has risen from $34.79 per hour, or to $34.79 per hour, and that's up from $33.49 per hour. This is a meaningful increase that reflects the essential volunteer work that the essential work that these volunteers have to our social fabric. This isn't just a national trend either. This increase happened across all 50 states, Puerto Rico, as well as here in the District of Columbia. But while we're seeing the progress in how we value a volunteer's time, there is a big gap in how we recognize their out-of-pocket expenses, particularly for those using personal vehicles to help organizations across the country. The federal mileage reimbursement rate for volunteer drivers has been stuck at 14 cents per mile for about 27 years now. Meanwhile, the business rate goes up every year. This year, it increases 70 cents per mile. This is a stark and quite frankly unfair disparity. Volunteer drivers are the lifeline of many essential services. They bring seniors to medical appointments, deliver food to homebound neighbors, and fill transportation gaps in rural and underserved communities. But with the rising cost of gas and maintenance and insurance, many volunteers, may start to step back from using their personal vehicles for supporting this important work. So this is why independent sector is supporting the Bipartisan Volunteer Driver Tax Appreciation Act. That's bills S1177 and HR 1452. These bills are being co-led in the House by the bipartisan members, Congressman Pete Stryber, a Republican from Minnesota, and Congresswoman Angie Craig, a Democrat from Minnesota, on the House side. And on the Senate side, Senator Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota and Senator Ted Budd, a Republican from North Carolina. And what this bill would do is it would lift the outdated cap and require that when the secretary is establishing the what the mileage reimbursement rate should be for nonprofits, that it be at least whatever the standard amount is, so 70 cents currently. So they could decide to establish it as higher. My best guess would be they would just kind of establish it as the same, but it would say that they couldn't establish it for as less. This bill is about fairness. It's about making sure that our policies match our value, and that we claim the value that we can claim to place on this service. And more importantly, it's about ensuring that nonprofits can continue to meeting the urgent needs without potentially losing the dedicated volunteers who make this possible. And if you are not familiar with the bills that I mentioned, you are definitely welcome to reach out. Otherwise, if you do believe that this is a bill that you would support, you can add your name to a action that IS posted just this week that I'm going to drop into the chat. Yes, I can repeat those bill numbers. It is S1177 in the Senate, and that's led, as I said, by Democrat Amy Klobuchar, Republican Ted Budd. And then in the House, it's HR 1582, which is co-led by two Minnesota members, Angie Craig, a Democrat, and Pete Stryber, a Republican. So really appreciate everybody's time here today. And if you do feel so compelled, I dropped that link in the chat, and please add your name to urge Congress to do right by these volunteers who are doing so much to help our communities.
Thank you, Travis. And those bill numbers are also in the action that Travis posted. So we have a question about reimbursement of expenses by the organization or volunteer deduction. So, and this question I know is from Paula Bugan, a volunteer expert. And so, Paula, if this is incorrect, I know you can correct me. So right now, the rate that is in law, the 14 cents limit, is both a limit on the standard mileage deduction that a volunteer driver can claim when they use their own vehicle. It is also the maximum amount that a nonprofit organization can reimburse a volunteer without that reimbursement becoming taxable to the volunteer, without it essentially being treated like wage income. So this number, this outrageously low number, limits both volunteers themselves and the reimbursements that nonprofits can pay them. Thank you for the question and the clarification, Paul. And I'll say I've been in a few meetings on the Hill with Travis. I know he does lots of them. Travis brings this inequity up frequently with legislative staff, and we get a lot of nodding heads. It's an issue that just makes sense. So again, we welcome further questions in the Q&A. We thought when we planned this month's webinar that we would be spending today unpacking all of the executive orders that we have seen rumored in the press. We're not doing that today because those have not been issued yet. Rumors continue to swirl, and we continue to try to track those. We're not going to spread rumors on this webinar today. We are happy to coordinate individually with folks, but the short answer is that there continue to be media reports and speculation about executive orders coming down that would carve out parts of the charitable sector, or that would impact PSLF, as Travis noted, or that would target foreign grant making. We've seen all of these floated in the press. We don't have anything to react to yet, but when we do, we certainly will. Along those lines, I would want to make sure that our viewers see the statement that Independent Sector and Council on Foundations and National Council of Nonprofits and United Philanthropy Forum all collectively issued around threats to one particular nonprofit, Harvard University's tax-exempt status. So that is some reflection of the vigilance and the posture that we're holding on this. If there are further questions about that, about volunteer mileage, about reconciliation, budget resolution, cuts to Medicaid, Medicare, SNAP, we will take them. Noting Chris Bugby, champion of AmeriCorps, note in the chat about cuts to AmeriCorps and legislation introduced to combat that. Thank you, Chris. I guess the additional thing I should note, if you are having a hard time tracking all of these developments, be they legislative, be they litigation, be they executive orders, you are not alone in that effort. Our attempt to help with that is a series of 3 trackers on those topics that Independent Sector recently released. That link is in the chat. We will share it in the wrap-up notes as well. And the trackers at that link will be updated every 2 weeks. So you can bookmark that link and check back frequently. I have a feeling there will be more to update. Again, we want to thank you for most of all the work that you do. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Travis. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Manuel. We look forward to staying in touch. Have a good afternoon.